Hello, it's LMDX. Today I will show you a useful technique to access applications running at the very restrictive CLS. So applications that listen and accept only connections from the local host. So from the host they are installed. And how can we access them remotely, for instance for maintenance or just to use them? So let's review the SSH port forwarding together. I will take my setup as an example. This is my Raspberry Pi. I use it to monitor temperature in my room, and I've got Jupyter Lab installed on it, so I can view and change setup remotely. But Jupyter Lab is pretty powerful application. It allows you to access terminal, to run some commands, and I'm not necessarily want to expose this application for anyone to use it, right? Because that would be a huge security risk. So if I try to access it directly, I will get the unable to connect message. So that means that the server, in my case Raspberry Pi, is not listening and not accepting connections on this port. Let's check that setup together. First of all, I will log into my Raspberry Pi and start the Jupyter server. Okay, I'm on my Raspberry Pi. Let's start Jupyter. Cool, so Jupyter Lab has started. And this is the IP address of my Pi. So we can check if we can access this Jupyter Lab remotely using browser. We need to put the proper port. So this is 8888. And as you can see, we cannot access this site because Jupyter is listening only on the local host. So it means that it's listening only for connections from within the Raspberry Pi. It's not accepting the external connections. How can we handle that? Well, we can use the SSH port forwarding to map port on my local laptop and in this case access application running on the Raspberry Pi. And that's pretty simple to do. We use the SSH command -L. Now we need to define the port on my local laptop that we want to use. So if we go here, this is my laptop that I'm using right now, and we need to define the local port that we want to accept connections. So let's say that's going to be 8080. You can pick any port you want. Now we need to define where we want this connection to be forwarded. And we want to forward our connection to the IP and port where the Jupyter Lab is actually listening to. So let's put that together and port 8888. Finally, I need to put my username and the server I'm using for the forwarding. And in my case, this is the actual Raspberry Pi itself. So this is my user, and this is the IP port of my IP address of my Raspberry Pi. So once again, local port, target IP, target port, which is once again the IP and port where the Jupyter server is listening on, then username and IP address of the server we are using to forward the connection. Okay, so let's try to access the Jupyter once again, but this time not using the IP of my Raspberry Pi, but using my local address. So this is the address of this specific device and the port we defined for connection forwarding. As you can see, Jupyter received this connection, and here I'm able to access my notebook and do whatever I need to do on this device. And here I've got my sample script that I'm using to read temperature from my Raspberry Pi. Okay, this is the very high level overview of how the SSH port forwarding works. Once again, you need to have access to the server where the application is installed, and you need to use this SSH access to forward your local port to the target IP and target port where the application is listening to. I hope that was interesting. That's all for today. All the best. LMTX.